Dear friends, good afternoon, and welcome to this event on forest fires. I am Stavros Lambrinidis, the European Union's ambassador to the United States. Now, we often talk about climate in general terms and in statistics, and we have to do this. When you look at the numbers, it is just scary, and it creates the imperative to act even more strong. But all these changes are affecting us personally, and they're affecting me personally as well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my personal experience. In my home country, Greece, this summer, we saw a prolonged heat wave above 113 degrees. This fueled huge fires that burned forest, olive tree plantations, vines, and houses. I was there, and I even saw some of them up close. On the big island of Evia, close to Athens, many who depended on the fire ravaged forest for their livelihoods are now facing destitution. Forest fires translate quickly into social problems. Here in the United States as well, the 2021 wildfire season saw some of the largest fires in U.S. history, including July's Dixie Fire, which ravaged for months. More than half of California's largest ever wildfires have burned in the last 4 years. And the fire season is starting earlier and ending later each year. This is the biodiversity and climate crises coming to our homes, our lives, and the lives of those who will inherit the earth after we're gone. Because the earth, quite frankly, has been doing fine for billions of years without humans and probably will do fine for billions of years after it. When we talk about fighting climate change, we're talking about protecting and saving humanity. And the urgency to act is what drives the European Green Deal, current work in Congress, and COP26 on climate that just finished, and don't forget COP15 on biodiversity that is to come in 2022. Forests have always burned naturally. We know this. It is part of nature's cycle, and some species have actually adapted to this, seeding only when fire is surrounding them. But we humans have interfered with these processes, and we have made forest fires intractable and unstoppable. And that's the issue. The severity of forest fires today is in part due to climate change, of course. Drought and high temperatures set the scene for a fire to become a true firestorm that defeats our capacity to respond. But forest fires are complex animals. Yes, climate change fuels them now, but there are trends that we have ignored for far too long. They are compounded by climate change today, making forest fires extremely dangerous. What I'm talking about is our exploitation of timber and wood products, the introduction of invasive species, water and soil pollution, the clearance of land for urban and agricultural use, which disconnects forest areas and weakens ecosystems that are interlinked. The direct exploitation of forests is a major reason why they are weaker today. High temperatures and drought do the rest. And let me just say, I am particularly pleased that at COP26, we managed to agree, over 100 countries, to the methane pledge, because methane is a gas that contains 80 times the heat that others do up in the atmosphere. It is fightable now, and if we do manage to fight it now, then I have to tell you the severity and the frequency of those extreme climate events could be under greater control. Now, a spark is all that is needed to trigger the devastation we are seeing across the Atlantic and elsewhere. So, as I said, the causes are interlinked. The solutions need to be interlinked too, obviously. We are working on it in similar ways, both the United States and the European Union. For example, there's ongoing cooperation on mapping forest fire risks between NASA and the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. One of the first big deals at COP26 was a commitment to halt the destruction of the world's forests, even reverse forest loss by 2030. Both the European Union and the United States have joined that pledge. Also at COP26, dozens of financial institutions pledged to eliminate their links to agricultural commodities that cause destruction of forests by 2025. In the European Union, just this week, we have proposed a new regulation against deforestation and forest degradation linked to certain commodities that enter the EU single market. The proposed new rules will guarantee that the products that EU citizens buy, use, and consume on the EU market do not contribute to global deforestation and forest degradation. We're putting our political will where our mouth is. The main driver of these processes is agricultural expansion linked to the commodities soy, beef, palm oil, wood, cocoa, and coffee, and some of their derived products. This is in the context of the EU biodiversity and forest strategies, within the bigger political priority of the European Green Deal. Now, let me stop here and wish you a great discussion on nature and forests. I am sure we will all hear and listen to the song of the redwood tree and of all the trees we depend on for our health, our economy, and our very survival. So, dear friends, I now give the floor to a special guest, Stephanie Shepard. Formerly the CEO of Kardashian West Brands, she is now an environmental advocate and social entrepreneur. She co-founded the climate education platform Future Earth to create positive change among younger generations on humanitarian and environmental issues. In addition, she's an ambassador to the Environmental Working Group, a board member of Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, and she is part of former Secretary of State John Kerry's initiative, World War Zero. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stephanie. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this wonderful event. Thank you, Ambassador Lambrinidis, for inviting me. I'm Stephanie Shepard, the co-founder of Future Earth, and it's an honor to open this panel on behalf of the European Union delegation to the United States. This summer here in the US, the West was on fire. On the East Coast, we saw a strong hurricane flooding Louisiana and parts of New York and New Jersey underwater. Folks, let's be honest. The climate crisis is here. Now more than ever, we have to look at the present with strong resolve and look to the future with hope. I have hope, thanks to the leadership here in the United States. We are on the verge of passing some of the strongest climate legislation in American history. Across the Atlantic, I see the EU is enacting substantial, historic legislation on climate change too. The European Green New Deal is not only going to help solve the climate crisis, it's going to create long-term sustainability and support vulnerable communities. And on the heels of the Glasgow conference, where nearly 200 countries came together to build a future for all of us, I see hope in building a global response to what is a global crisis. Most importantly, I see hope in the work I do every day. I see a generation of young Americans who are just as worried about what we are doing to the earth as I am. The kids know what's up, and they want to be a part of the solution. As the co-founder of Future Earth, an environmental activism nonprofit, my goal is the same as every single person here: to enact change for a healthier future. We know people want to get involved, but many don't fully understand the problem, much less how they can be a part of fixing it. This conversation shouldn't just be in the hands of lawmakers and academics. It's got to be on social media, in film, in fashion, and a relatable part of everyday life. And let me say this, as someone who lives in LA, I've seen firsthand the impact of the wildfires, and so have many of my friends and colleagues, and it's been devastating. The bottom line is this: the work is far from done. We've got to keep the conversation going to effectively move the world towards a cleaner, healthier, and safer future. With that, I'd like to thank the European Union for putting together this important conversation and for inviting me to speak. I hope that all of you watching today will carry forward this conversation in your own communities. Now let's get going.
Oh, hello, and welcome to our expert panel on forest fires. This is an event that is being organized by the European Union delegation to the US, by the Western Environmental Law Center, and also the Nature Conservancy. It's in the context of the Films Across Borders Festival, organized by the American University. And there's a film screening included in your registration, a film that you can watch anytime. My name is Manuel. I work in the delegation here covering environment and oceans. And I have to tell you, as our ambassador was saying at the beginning, I've also experienced forest fires firsthand in my village. I was 13 years old at the time. And it's an image that stayed with me, and it will stay with me forever. It makes an impression of you, a terrible impression, and I can see still the fear in the faces of the whole village when we were looking at our deer forests being destroyed. I do think that this deep impact is also a deep connection we have with forests. Forests, in a way, represent nature. If we think of the word nature, normally range, a beautiful mountain full of trees will come to mind. This is no coincidence. But now the EU and the US are facing extreme weather and other trends that end up causing megafires, firestorms, fires that we have not seen before. And as the ambassador remarked, they are very difficult to respond to. These are challenges for the EU and the US alike. And on both sides of the Atlantic, we are fighting this trend. In the EU, in 2021, we adopted the EU Forest Strategy, and we have recently also adopted the proposal the ambassador mentioned against deforestation. In the US, in 2021, also the infrastructure bill is already signed by the president, and it includes for the US Forest Service $50 billion on climate resilience that will include, of course, resilience of forest to forest fires. So let's find solutions and cooperate today. We have a panel of experts from across the Atlantic, from both sides. We have José Manuel Moreno, a professor at the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. We have also Susan Jane Brown, Wildlife Program Director and Staff Attorney at the Western Environmental Law Center. And last but not least, we have Cecilia Clavé, working at the Nature Conservancy, a senior policy advisor on forest restorations and fire. So let's kick off this discussion. I hope everybody is there. I can see you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being available today. And I would like to directly kick off with one question for the three of you. We have just finished the two very difficult sessions of the very two difficult weeks at COP26. So my first question would be, what are the links between carbon emissions reduction and forest management? So perhaps, Professor Moreno, you can start.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. Wildfires in the Mediterranean countries of the European Union were funneled in the 1970s and 80s by land abandonment and afforestation that took place in these countries since the second half of the last century. As a result, forest areas increased and the landscapes became more hazardous. This led to an extraordinary increment of forest fires. In the 80s, we had multiplied several-fold the figures early in the century. In Spain, at that time, we were burning over 250,000 hectares every year, and some years we almost reached 500,000 hectares. The take-home message from the historical experience is that populating semi-arid and dry lands with vegetation and forests must be made with great care, great caution, because if you fill them in with vegetation, it will burn. Today, there is urgent need to mitigate climate change, and planting trees is advocated by many. Indeed, many countries have submitted their NDCs to the Paris Accord with plans to increase their carbon sink capacity by way of reforesting many areas. But in Mediterranean and similar subtropical areas, this cannot be made ignoring the fact that what you plant today will be the fuel that will burn tomorrow. We need to mitigate climate change and enhance our carbon sink capacity. But this must be made wisely, considering the risk of fire. If not, we will fall into the fire trap, which can further contribute to promote land degradation in these areas. Planting trees, managing our ecosystem, ignoring the risk of fire, can result in a problem, not in a solution.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jose Manuel. Susan Jane, please, would you come in, please?
Sure. Thank you so much. I definitely agree with the professor. We have a number of tools here in the United States that we could be taking advantage of to better manage our forests in a way to sequester carbon for the long term and also to reduce the wildfire risk. For example, there are a number of organizations, mine included, that participate in what we call forest collaboratives, where we bring together diverse stakeholders, so conservation interests, wildlife managers, members of the timber industry, land managers, ranchers, many different stakeholders, to really come together and discuss, based on the best available science, how to manage our adjacent federal public lands. And that kind of work really does bring in scientific experts that can tell us how we can intervene in a scientifically responsible way in our forests to manage them for reducing wildfire risk. And that's one of the things that we've been able to do in some places. But that kind of work does take time, and it takes federal investment. Thankfully, recently, Congress here in the United States enacted a piece of legislation that will put much needed funds to that kind of restoration work so that we can hopefully reduce the wildfire risk for our Western forests in the future. I do think it's important to note, though, that we're not really talking about fireproofing our forests. Our Western forest evolves with fire, and really it's a question of how we restore our forests so that they are more resilient to future disturbance, which, as the professor indicated, has been stoked by a changing climate.
Thank you very much. So we hear already stakeholder management, an important element, being sure that to make progress, everybody's involved, everybody has a voice, particularly local communities, indigenous communities. We had also, you cannot plant anywhere, anything. This has to be properly done and mapped and the risk assessed. Cecilia, please, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. Happy to be here. I'll just add a little bit. I mean, I agree with the professor and what Susan Jane just said. I'll just add in terms of emissions that forests are both a solution to climate while also being at the same time impacted by climate. So forest management activities that help to reduce wildfire risk are meant to help in reducing the impacts of wildfire and thus emissions as well. Meanwhile, as a natural climate solution, activities like reforestation, when done in a science-informed manner, can increase carbon storage.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cecilia. So it is clear that between inverted commas, using forests for sequestering carbon is not as easy as it seems. It needs to be planned. It needs to be involved stakeholders. You made really, really crucial points. But now I'm coming back a bit to the title of the event, and people that are online watching us probably wonder, why are forest fires becoming mega fires in some parts of the EU and the US? Because, okay, there's climate change, but how does it work that these fires become absolutely intractable, put lives in danger, ruin economies, and ruin whole towns? Please, Jose Manuel, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Climate change is increasing temperatures, reducing precipitation in subtropical areas such as the Mediterranean region and some other subtropical areas in the world. And this has been accompanied by an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme climate and weather events. The fire weather danger is increasing in these areas. In the European Union countries, we have been able to set tremendous firefighting capacities. Today, we have real armies to fight forest fires. These armies are efficient when the conditions are not severe. But under severe weather, the fire perimeter quickly reaches tens of kilometers, and the capacity to deter fire is limited. A few extreme events account for this disproportionate share of the total area burned every year. Hence, the efforts for containing fires during a year can be ruined in just a couple of big events. These are the conditions that are becoming ever more frequent and will become more so as global warming continues. Because extreme fires produce higher severities, greater impacts on the ecosystem, and they may even be followed by additional cascading events. For instance, in some of these areas, extreme rainfall occur in autumn, and this can occur after fire. So all of this, they can ally to produce the worst outcome. So this is the future that we are facing, a future of more extreme situation, of more extreme fire weather, of larger and more severe weathers. We need to specifically plan for this.
Thank you, Jose Manuel. So, Susan Jane, I wanted to ask you in relation to that. Then, the mega fires that you have experienced in that part of your country where you are, how is the perception of these mega fires? How do they come to be? What's the discussion over there?
Yes, it's an interesting situation, and I think we're seeing larger fires for two main reasons. The first has to do with how we have historically managed our Western federal public lands. And in the United States, there are millions of acres of federally owned land, which on EU scales can be a bit difficult to comprehend. But we have millions of acres that are federally publicly owned. And we've managed much of that acreage for timber production over the past many decades. And that timber harvest has focused on removing the largest, most commercially valuable trees, but also the ones that resist wildfire the best and other disturbances such as insects and diseases. So that past management history of removing the large fire-resistant trees, and then followed by many decades of highly successful fire suppression, has created a situation where many of our Western federal lands are just not resistant to wildfire. We've removed the trees that are resistant to fire, and we've allowed smaller trees to grow up in the wake of fire suppression. So we've now created very flammable conditions on much of our federal public lands. So when a fire does begin, there's millions of acres or thousands of acres that are susceptible to high intensity wildfire. We also have the growth of the wildland-urban interface, which is that area where people are building up into forested ecosystems. So when fires happen, not only are we looking at large conflagrations that are burning forested areas, but they're moving into areas where people live. And so we're seeing large fires that are burning millions of acres and destroying homes and communities. And so that's one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in megafires in the West. The other thing that we are seeing, and this is what happened here in my state of Oregon in 2020, was we had a series of very strong east winds. Usually on the west coast of the United States, the winds come in from the ocean and blow eastward. But every so often, we do get very strong east winds that tend to happen in the fall. And when we have these east winds, when you have a fire start, which happens regularly in the late summer and fall in the West, those fires then push the fire in a way that act just like a bellows. And you end up with having very large fires in forests that typically don't see those large types of wildfires. They occur on the west side of the Cascades, which are much wetter forests than our interior west forests. Those east winds are occurring more frequently and are stronger because of climate change. So we're seeing both a legacy of past management resulting in larger wildfires, also driven by changing climate. And then we have unusual wind events that are a current thing that we know that happens, but they're occurring much more regularly and they're stronger. So we're seeing a lot of influences of climate change on our forests that are driving an increase in severity of wildfires.
Thank you so much for that. As you were talking, I could actually visualize the whole process. So that was extremely clear to me. Thank you so much for that. Cecilia, we heard from Jose Manuel and from Susan Jane, particularly Jose Manuel, he talked about armies of firefighters. It seems that our better soldiers in terms of trees have been the first to fall, and this is part of the cause. So how do you explain megafires, Cecilia? The floor is yours.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again, please?
Yeah, I was just asking the same question about how do you conceptualize megafires? How do you understand megafires, the process, how they work?
Sure. I don't know that I have too much to add. In the United States, all of the factors that Susan Jane mentioned, I completely agree with. I would just emphasize that climate change has just exacerbated these megafires in a way that is just huge, right? And getting all this attention. I'll note that in a lot of places and historically, indigenous peoples and local peoples, communities have and still live in harmony with fire and using fire as a tool to help shape the landscape in and around where they live. And for millennia, humans have had long relationships with fire, and it's a system that is overall broken, and what we're trying to repair here.
I think it's important what you brought to the discussion, the fact that this is is part also of the traditional knowledge, and this is a knowledge that is very important to manage forest fires properly. So I would like to throw to you a third question. This one on adapting forest management to climate change. Now, how can we, if that is the good solution, stress prevention as opposed to response? What are the good solutions for this, given that, as we were seeing earlier, they are more and more intractable and devastating? So please, the question is to you, Jose Manuel, first.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, that's a hard question, but anyway, let me go to the policies that are implemented on this side of the ocean, because I think they are a little different from what it is in the United States. Here, basically in the Mediterranean countries, the aim of firefighting services is to reduce area burn. All fires are suppressed as quickly as possible and at all cost. That has been a policy that was successful, and actually, for instance, the figures that we have for this decade are virtually 1/3 of the figures we used to have in the 80s. So really, they have been able to bring down wildfire, particularly area burn. But as I have indicated earlier, this is not adequate for the kind of extreme weather that we are facing. Under this condition, we will not be able to stop fires. Therefore, we need to shift the focus. And shifting in a way that we consider our ecosystem in the way they have evolved, and they evolve with fire. Most of them, under normal circumstances, depending on what type of fires you have, but under normal circumstances, they will recover after burning. So we need to manage our ecosystems here, allowing fire to play its ecological role. This is something totally new, because since ever, here the policy has been fire is bad, we have to knock it off quickly. This means that we need to manage for particular objectives, and we must concentrate not so much on reducing area, but on reducing the damages that the fire causes. And that's a different paradigm, because that requires that we need to know in advance what are the damages that a fire could cause in terms of carbon sequestration capacity, losses of timber, of soil, of biodiversity, of amenity value, what have you, but manage for one particular objective, because you probably will not be able to achieve all of them. So, and that requires that we know at each place the risk that we have. I heard Ambassador saying a collaboration that is going on between NASA and the Joint Research Center, precisely to map risk. We need risk mapping so that the managers can act accordingly. And in this context, we need to allow fire play a role, because, as I say, not all of them are bad, and we may use fires on purpose by prescribed use of them, or even in an opportunistic way, because the fire that we allow today is the fire that will not burn tomorrow under extreme conditions. So by letting some fires that break out for whatever circumstances, and letting them burn the fuel that we have, what we will be doing is avoiding a very damaging fire in the future under extreme condition. Here in the Euro-Mediterranean countries, we need to change our paradigm, and we need to focus on the risk caused by fires, not on the risk of fire alone. This is the way we can live with fire, and we can adapt to live with extreme fires that are coming.
Thank you, Jose Manuel. That was very clear, and it sounds always contradictory to say that fire plays a role, but indeed it's an ecological trend. It's an ecological event that has been happening forever. So it's a matter of not interfering with natural cycles. Thank you for that. Susan Jane, I would give you the floor now for the same question. How can we adapt forest management in these times?
Sure. Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things that we can do, and I'll talk about one of them, and that's community preparedness. So I talked a little bit about how we can work together to implement large landscape restoration projects that increase forest resiliency to wildfires. But one of the other things that we also need to do is make sure that our communities, particularly those that are located in the wild and urban interface, are prepared for the inevitable wildfire that is likely to come. And the way to do that is to clear brush and trees from around homes, outbuildings, infrastructure, roads, that sort of thing. Make sure that building materials are made of fire-resistant materials. Make sure that vents are blocked so that embers that blow in from a wildfire don't get into the eaves of homes and then cause a structure fire. There are a lot of those kinds of community preparedness things that we should be doing, that homeowners should be doing, communities need to be doing to ensure that their communities themselves are prepared for the inevitable wildfire. And it is something that it's not certain that even if you take these measures that your home may survive a wildfire, but coupled with those landscape treatments and community preparedness, it really does give communities a fighting chance to survive a wildfire. Be prepared for that inevitability is really essential. So even things again like building materials, but also making sure that communities have evacuation plans and that there is first responder communication channels that are open, and so that first responders, fire, emergency services can operate and can reach communities in order to evacuate residents that are facing a fire. So those kinds of programs and activities are things that we really need to implement here in the United States. And I would guess it's also probably true elsewhere in the world as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Susan Jane. I think it's important what you were mentioning, the fact that communities need to be prepared at the level of actually making arrangements in your house, corridors, safe corridors when forest fires happen. This is crucial, and plannings, protocols, that can go a long way. Thank you. Cecilia, please, your turn. How do we adapt forest management in the US, for example, to these mega fires?
Sure. First, I'd like to highlight that in the U.S., we have a national cohesive wildland fire strategy, and it highlights three main areas. Response, which is the suppression, the fire-adapted communities that Susan Jane just spoke about, and restoring and maintaining landscapes, which is what the professor was speaking to. Historically, we have emphasized as a nation the first part, the suppression. And the professor mentioned the paradigm shift that's needed. The paradigm shift for us is emphasizing the other two sort of legs of the cohesive strategy, the landscape, the restoring the landscape, improving wildfire resilience, and the fire adapted communities piece. I'll say part of the resilience work that needs to be done across the landscape is applying fire to the ground, essentially fighting fire with fire. So applying controlled burn treatments to prepare that that landscape for a wildfire to come through. All this to say, we still need to put out certain wildfires. If they're threatening people, there are certain things that we need to do to protect homes and watersheds and recreation areas. And at the same time, trying to see how we can manage those fires. So more emphasis needs to be placed as well on managing those fires when they do come through. And of course, investing and promoting a workforce that can help proactively treat these landscapes with controlled burning and through wildland fire management. One of the areas that had been a challenge for us in the United States is investment in these types of in this type of work. It has historically been investments in suppression and not response. And so it's really encouraging to see our Congress and our administration propose and now enacting legislation that would direct significant amounts of funding to this work. So we look forward to working with our government, with states, with tribes, with partners in getting this work done at a massive scale.
Thank you, Cecilia. That's very illustrating of the challenges ahead and the action that has been taken at also federal level in which you are involved. So that's great. I want to come back to what probably is our last question as a panel. Then we will go for questions and answers because we want to hear what the audience has to say and ask you as experts on forest fires. So this question would be about something that has kind of surfaced before, is about ownership of forests. How do they impact this work on prevention that we were mentioning? The ownership structure, I'm sure, is very different in the EU and the US. So Jose Manuel, please.
This is an important issue, and it has to do with involving the community, as both Susan Jane and Cecilia have been talking about. This involvement must be done not only once the fire is there, but before. And I would say an example of what happened or what is happening now, fortunately, I think, after the disaster of the 2017 extreme fire in Pedregal in Portugal. The Pedregal fire was possible because the area had been fully planted with trees. It's an area that was in the 50s. It was, as many other areas in the Iberian Peninsula, they were abandoned. People, they wanted to get something in return, so they planted trees. And in places where fires were not known, years later, there we had tremendous and extremely dangerous fires like the one in Pedregal. Now, after this fires in which tens of people died, then some of my colleagues from University of Lisbon sat together with the locals and said, well, what can we do? Because we need to change the way we have been managing our landscape. And sure enough, what we're doing is thinking of a landscape that is prone to fire. So that means that if the trees grow well and they can plant them for a profit, you can have 100% of your land planted with trees. You can have a certain amount of trees. The rest, you must devote it to other land uses so that overall the whole risk of the area will not wipe out the whole thing when a fire comes through. So this is what they are doing now. They are planning the territory. So it's not just when the fire occurs, preparedness, etc. No. Here we must be prepared before, because at least here in the Iberian Peninsula, most of our landscapes, they are not pristine, they are not original, they are man-made. So definitely when such a fire of this type occurs, we need to plan the future. And this is what they are doing now. Of course, this is complicated because imagine if my property is the one that is decided that will not be planted, then I would not get the benefit of it. So that means that unless the whole community is involved and takes care of the whole planning and of course of the costs and benefits, this will not be possible. So really working bottom up, involving the whole community for the planning ahead, I think is a very critical thing to do. And hopefully these kind of things, I hope that we will see more of them happening here on this side of the continent, because it's the way forward.
Thank you very much, Jose Manuel. It's clear. I remember very well 2017. Thank you for bringing up this example. It was a terrible experience, and actually was a wake-up call in the EU. It was a real tragedy. Right. I turn to you, Susan Jane, on the same issue. How forest ownership impacts good forest management. Floor is yours.
Yeah, it's jurisdictional issues are really a challenge, and the professor was talking about some of those challenges. Here in the United States, we have three main landowners that we have to coordinate with whenever we're talking about forest and fire management. We have the federal government, and we have state governments and state lands, and then we have private landowners. And all three of those landowners bear responsibility and have a unique role to play when it comes to forest and fire management. On the federal side, we've talked a little bit about that. The federal government manages millions of acres of federal land in very large parcels, particularly in the western United States. And with that estate comes the obligation to responsibly manage those lands. Then you have states, which also have a large land ownership. Our states include federal land within them. So you do have an ongoing conversation between the states and the federal government. Here in the western United States, recently we've seen the three West Coast states, Oregon, Washington, and California, really step up and appropriate millions of dollars. In the case of California, I believe it was $2 billion towards wildfire adaptation and mitigation programs and projects on the ground. So the states have really started to take some responsibility for their part in how fires are managed and how forests, as the professor was saying, are managed before the wildfire. So the states and the federal government are starting to work more closely together here in the United States to address this issue. And then there's that third piece, which are private landowners, both small landowners, so people that have a home in the wildland-urban interface, but also very large industrial timberland owners, your Weyerhaeusers and Plum Creeks. They manage a very large land mass as well. And those lands are managed for different outcomes than federal lands or state lands. And so you've got a very complicated situation going on with three main types of landowners, three different objectives for how that land might be managed, three very different sets of legal obligations. And yet we're all being affected by climate change and how these fires are changing in their severity, in the time of year that we're experiencing these fires, and what happens in the aftermath of those fires. We're starting to see what scientists call type conversion occurring here in the United States, where conifer forests are no longer coming back as conifer forests after repeated wildfires. They're coming back as shrub and other types of deciduous vegetation. So we are seeing a lot of changes that are being driven by a combination of, again, past management, current management, climate change, and things are changing out there. And I think it really speaks to the urgency that we all, or at least many of us, feel with taking action on climate change. And I think fire and forest management is a substantial piece of that change that's coming.
Thank you so much, Susan Jane. It's interesting what you were saying about the divisions of labor and the different administrative levels and the impact they have. it's something. I mean, forest fires do not care much about this, and yet we are kind of stuck in that situation. But good to hear that resources are being put forward in some states in the West to react to these mega fires. Thank you so much, Cecilia. I turn to you now. But before I do, I would like to remind our audience, are online. There are people behind the screen somewhere there. This is the time to think about your questions, because after Cecilia's intervention, we will be going back to you, and you have the chance to ask about megafires and what's at the stake with climate change in the chat, in the questions and answers section. So Cecilia, coming back to the discussion. How do forest ownership is critical for improving forest management and adapting to climate change?
Yeah, thank you for that. And to build on, what Susan Jane said about the different categories and the complexity, it's even more complex across the three different areas that she identified. Just as an example, for the federal piece, you have multiple agencies managing multiple different types of land. So you have the Bureau of Land Management, you have the Forest Service, the National Park Service, and they each have different mandates for how they manage the landscape, and can take different approaches. At the state level, you have, we have 50 states, and across the West, each state also has their own approach to how they want to manage, or how they do manage, their landscapes. And the same goes for private lands as well. I mentioned before our emphasis on applying fire to the ground, applying these controlled burns to help restore the landscape and get them back to a healthier place. I'll say on the private land side, we've had a lot of success in the southeastern United States. There's been a culture of acceptance of that particular type of strategy. There's a whole network of private contractors and certified burners and experienced landowners who work together to plan and implement these types of burns. In the West, it's a little bit more challenging. You do have a different landscape in the West. You have more mountains, you have sort of a different landscape that requires approaching it slightly differently. But, we're trying to get to that place where we bring everyone together to have these conversations. I think I'll emphasize that collaboration. We can't do this work without collaboration. So when you look at a landscape and you have this patchwork of federal, state, tribal, private lands, counties, local communities, cities, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, they need to come together and come to an agreement on how those lands will be managed, and accept some of or share the risk of the management, and also share the responsibility of the management of those landscapes.
Okay, thank you so much. And we're going to jump now to the questions and answers. So all those of you listening in to this event, now is the time to ask the questions. We have received some of them, so I'm going to start, but please go ahead and send some more questions if you have them. I hope so. We have one question from the audience, and I'm going to read it to the panelists. This is: to what extent are lessons learned from forest fires in the United States applicable to forest fires in Europe or in other places, and vice versa? So, anybody wants to take the floor? Tricky question. Professor Manuel? Or Susan Jane?
I suppose we can take both views.
Yeah.
Fires are fires. You need fuel, you need conditions, and these are general. You can stop them or not. You can manage them in one way or another. You can anticipate them in one way or another. But I think there is a lot to learn. And actually, here I would say that over this side, we can learn a lot from managing landscapes that are more pristine, more natural. As I said before, here in Europe, we don't have anything that is pristine. I mean, we have been for too long around. Our forests are virtually man-made, all of them. As I said before, the role of fire hasn't been contemplated, is not contemplated even today. So as we move on to really and hasn't been contemplated, although I must say that paleoecological records, they say that we had fires here, say 4,000 years ago, not the type of fires that we have now. They were different. But our system have evolved under fire pressure. So I think we can learn a lot here on this side on how to manage areas that are more pristine, that less human transform, and more introducing the ecological role of fire in it. Because as I said, here we don't have that much experience.
Thank you, Jose Manuel. Cecilia, Susan Jane, you want to? Cecilia, please.
Sure, I'll go ahead. So the Nature Conservancy has a North America fire team, and we've already been collaborating with EU partners through our prescribed fire training exchanges, also called TREX. And for over a decade, our practitioners from Europe and elsewhere around the world have been participating in TREX events in the United States. Participants come together, they share their experiences, they learn from others, they engage with local communities, and they implement the controlled burning together. And so it provides a cooperative burning model that meets the needs of diverse entities, including federal, state, private, contractors, tribes, academics, and international partners. So that's one of the ways. And just as an example, for the last 10 years, we've had over 200 fire practitioners from Spain and Portugal that have attended TREX events in the United States. And they've returned to Europe, and we hope, that they've shared their experiences from the training. And we know that there's been we actually had our first TREX event outside of the United States in 2017 in Portugal. And we continue to partner, with Portugal and in Spain. In 2019, we had our first TREX training there as well. And then, the other one would be to look at some of the practices that have worked well for us in the United States. And I think of some of the programs that help support cross-boundary work and large landscape scale work. And I think of one of our federal programs called the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. That speaks to what I mentioned before about bringing the different partners and stakeholders to the table and plan out a project that will help reduce the risk of wildfire and improve resiliency.
Thank you so much. So a great initiative. Another angle to cooperation. So we had a risk mapping between NASA and the Joint Research Center. We have also training programs going on, exchanges in two of the key countries for forest fires in Europe, Portugal and Spain. So Susan Jane, you want to come in this one?
Sure. I agree with both of those sentiments. And I think the one thing that I would add, two things. One, I always enjoy hearing from fire practitioners in the EU who are in a Mediterranean climate, because that's what we also have here in Oregon. And I find the conversation around the same fire behavior and forest management issues are very similar in a lot of ways. And I think that sort of recognition that globally we are facing many of the same challenges and experiencing undesirable outcomes across the globe, even though we're very far apart, but we're experiencing very similar things in terms, in this case, of megafires. So I think sort of that framing and recognizing that we are really all in this together is really important. And it leads me to also observe that really this is about climate change. And we are experiencing a changing climate that is affecting natural processes like fire. And those outcomes that we are experiencing are things that we as society do not want to see happen. And so it is, for me, a further acknowledgement of the need to act globally. We need to act locally as well. And hopefully the new investment from the United States Congress in forest restoration and resiliency will help the United States take some important actions. But really, we do need to act locally to the extent that we can in our own neighborhoods and our own ecosystems. But also, we do need to act globally as well. And I think the last couple of weeks in Glasgow have put a finer point on that. We have a lot of work ahead, and it's not easy. It is going to take partnership, and it's going to be difficult. But I don't think that we have any other alternative. We really must act, and it starts with making sure that we're taking care of our forests.
Thank you so much, Susan Jane. Indeed, we're beginning to comprehend the global issues and trying to tackle them together. There's no, as you were saying, there's no other way. I have in my watch 5 minutes left. I would go for a last question, if you can answer, of whoever can answer it in a matter of minutes or seconds. But this is more for the US panelists, in fact, because it's a question about how does continued logging of large old trees and patch clear cutting relate to fire vulnerability. I think Susan Jane went through this slightly before, but if you want to add, I don't know, examples of, where this has happened, how can we,
Sure.
how can we tackle this?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. So like I was saying before, first of all, we have to keep jurisdiction in mind. So there are a lot of landowners here in the United States. When it comes to the federal government and their management of our federal public lands, we do still see the commercial harvest of large old trees. It does not happen as regularly or frequently or as ubiquitously as it used to back in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. But we do still see that occur on federal public lands. And it's usually done for timber production, for economic recovery. And where I think many scientists, and in fact, I think the vast majority of scientists come down on this, is that there is simply no ecological justification for the continued logging of mature and old growth trees. So for us here in the United States, those are trees that are 120, 150 years old and older. And we do still have those trees here on our federal public lands. And sometimes the federal land management agencies do decide to harvest those trees. It's very controversial socially and has really no ecological justification for it. So that is one area of policy that I think many of us here in the United States would like the government to enact, which is a federal policy that protects those old trees in perpetuity. We know that those trees are very valuable for wildlife, and we also know that they are excellent at sequestering and storing carbon for the long term. So if we're going to really restore the resiliency of our forests and make sure that they are resistant to fire in the future, it needs to start with protecting those mature and old growth trees.
Thank you so much for that. And I think we've reached the time that we had for today. Unfortunately, I think the discussion has been extremely wide. We have covered a lot of terrain to explain why these megafires are with us and how, more importantly, how we can fight them in a good way. We have discussed stakeholders. We have discussed, measure the fire's impacts not by area, but measure them by the damage they do, and do not interfere with natural cycles. Fires have been there forever, but we need to not interfere with those natural fires, if I may. So. this is the end of it. I would like to thank you very much. Again, I repeat myself, but it's been a great discussion. And as we close, I wanted to thank our audience also, because they have joined us for this hour on this important conversation about forest fires and climate change. As a reminder, everyone will have complimentary access to watch online the Spanish film Fire Will Come, which is available through November 24th. So look out for an email from the EU, from the European Union, with details on how to access this movie. We hope you continue to follow this important issue and join us for future conversations. Goodbye for now.